Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
After holding series of high-level meetings, the government finally announced additional customs duties on 19 items last night. This includes aviation turbine fuel, refrigerators, washing machine, air conditioners, speakers, footwear. The Reserve Bank followed that up this morning by easing liquidity rules for banks. So the government is moving to curb the appetite for dollars to rein in the rupee, and the central bank is rushing in to free up some liquidity for the markets. But nothing seems to be stopping the fall in NBFC stocks on account of the liquidity concerns. At least that's showing up on Dalal Street. Bank stocks continue to remain under pressure, and NBFCs continued to be impacted negatively. A senior government official has told CNBC TV18, and I quote, "The current stress surrounding crude and currency is just a small storm, and that India is on a sustainable growth path." Amidst this backdrop, the government has also now announced a new high-level advisory group headed by Surjit Bhalla on future trade policies. Joining me now to discuss that and more is a member of that high-level advisory group that's just been formed, the former Commerce Secretary Rajiv Kher. Also with us, the former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Minmani. But before we start the conversation, here's the Minister of State for Civil Aviation, Jayant Sinha, on the 5% duty imposed on aviation turbine fuel and the impact it will have on industry.
We will have to see, first of all, whether this is going to have any impact on fuel prices in the country, because, as you know, only a very limited amount of aviation turbine fuel is actually imported into India. So we'll have to see whether that does impact. That's the first aspect of it. And then the second aspect of it is that every time that there is an increase in any input cost, which we don't know yet whether will happen or not, that then does get reflected in pricing.
Well, that's the Minister of State for Civil Aviation saying won't have a significant impact on the aviation sector, but the stock market's punishing those stocks nevertheless. Let's go across now to our guest. Joining us now to take this discussion forward, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory, now the high-level advisory group, Rajiv Kher, also the former Commerce Secretary, and with us, the former Chief Economic Advisor, Arvind Minmani. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here. Mr. Kher, if I could start by asking you, and I'll talk to you about the advisory group that's just been announced today in just a second, sir, but I want to talk about the import curbs announced by the government last night. Now, by all accounts, and I'm taking a look at what the rating agencies are saying, and this is the report from CARE, these imports constitute merely 2.5% of the total imports in FY18, and hence these measures are unlikely to have any significant impact. So what's the point of the measures that have been announced by the government?
Well, Shireen, I think you need to look at it in a much broader context. It's not just the action in terms of curbing imports, but it's the larger implication that this particular act government perceives will have over the broad sentiment in the markets. If the current account deficit is increasing, it's attributed to a vast array of factors, whether it's the increase in oil prices, or its depreciation of rupee, or it's generally a global economic scenario which is building up on account of trade wars and so on. So it has to be seen in that broad context, and at the same time you also have to recognize that import restrictions will always have a limited implication in a positive sense, because the more and more we try to do that, we endanger the value chains. And if you notice what the government has done, it's essentially the final products. So the consumer products. So essentially what the government has done is addressed those products where the value chains are not there in India, and they are final products, and therefore the maximum effect that you can actually visualize would be on price increases for the consumers. So that's all. But it is not going to adversely affect India's capacities to export or India's capacities to manufacture.
Okay, won't impact the supply chain. It's mostly the finished products that have been impacted by these import curbs. And Dr. Virmani, let me come to you and ask you, given these 19 items that the government has decided to pick, and there were all kinds of recommendations that came in from various ministries, including the Steel Ministry, etc., that don't seem to have found their way into the first list. I don't know if a second list is under preparation or whether we will see a second installment of these curbs. But on the face of it, do you believe that this goes beyond having a symbolic messaging impact?
See, there are many ways to look at it. One way is to look at it in the context of what happened in the budget. Certain actions were already taken. I see this as second act. Now, in the short term, I have seen this so many times before, so I'm afraid I'm getting very old. People are very young. I have seen this in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the short term, actually every action can be justified, and it does have some positive effect.
Yes.
On the positive side, just to complete, which was your original question, even if the amounts are like 1% or something, there is a positive short-term effect on how people view the current account, on how they view the rupee, etc. But my problem is the long term, because as I said, it's a very, very slippery slope, because each time you do something, some other breach opens up. And that is how the old license permit Raj was built by Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Every time you do a little, it sounds perfectly okay, and then you find 6 other problems arise, and you try to close those 6 problems, and then you build another structure. So it's the complexity and this fineness. You can never get it right. I have seen it, as I said, for 3 decades. You can't select and select and select and so on, which is why in the 90s we moved to just deciding that 90% you just put a uniform duty, and I have recommended this every year to the budget since the new government came.
As
just
the
put
Niti
a 10%
Aayog.
duty
I
on
mean,
everything.
as has the Niti Aayog.
Now, if you had a...
You're absolutely right, sir. And as has the Niti Aayog very recently as well. So this seems to be an effort from the time that we saw the budget, of doing a U-turn on that.
So, if there's a very temporary problem, I would have said if you had a 10% uniform duty and you said for 2 years to solve the CAD problem or a fiscal deficit problem, I would have accepted it as a temporary measure. I would say even now, if after the next budget they get rid of all this very selective and fine-tuning of duties, I would still say not much harm has been caused. But the long-term consequences, unfortunately, which I see, is that we had this great opportunity to shift the supply chains from China because of the tariff war between US and China. There is a huge opportunity for shifting those FDI and supply chains. What really makes me sad is that we are missing that opportunity.
Okay, missing that opportunity. Rajiv Kheran, that's exactly why this new advisory group has been set up, headed by Surjit Bhalla. You're a member of this advisory group, which also has the former Foreign Secretary, now with the Tatas, Mr. Jaishankar, as one of the members of it. I don't know if Mr. Virmani will say that this is a story that he's seen play out several times in the past, but let me ask you, sir, the fact that we require another advisory group to look at issues when we already have a panel that's looking at issues related to import substitution, we already have a panel that's looking at issues related to the current account deficit. I mean, what is this panel now going to do? Because if I look at your terms of reference, it talks about exchange rate management, it talks about boosting India's share in global trade, it talks about managing bilateral trade relations. How is this going to be different from the several other committees that we've had so far?
Well, Shireen, actually, I am not the right person to answer that question. This has been created by the government, and it's the government and the Department of Commerce which should actually address this question. As far as I am concerned, referring to what Dr. Virmani was saying earlier, I recognize that this action, if seen in isolation, might appear to be short-term, but I think we need to look at in a much broader context once again, and I would refer you to the various trade formations which are being talked about in this context. And I would, the kind of opportunity that Dr. Virmani was talking about, looking at the broader context of tariffs in the context of getting ourselves on the value chains, etc. I think that is an issue which will have to be addressed when we enter the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement. So there the government has that opportunity of addressing the whole issue of global value chains and participation on account of China's vacation of certain lower value added products, etc. So I was not looking at this present action in that context, because I am aware that context will have to be addressed at an appropriate time, maybe at the time when government decides to join the RCEP finally, when concluding the agreement. So that's why I am not, I did not address those broader issues, and I am very, very well aware that there are a whole lot of competitiveness related issues which need to be addressed.
Okay, I won't put you in a spot, sir, so let me put this question then to Dr. Virmani. Dr. Virmani, if I look at the terms of reference for the special advisory group that's been set up, the third theme as part of the terms of reference is mainstreaming of new age policy making, and it says, can exchange rate management be a medium to long-term instrument in shaping trade objectives? What should be India's policy on exchange rates in light of this assessment in the face of tariff-based negotiations on bilateral and multilateral forums? Given what we are seeing happen as far as the rupee is concerned, it seems very clear now that 73 seems to be where the government finds itself uncomfortable and hence trying to defend that level. In the short term, and this committee is expected to give its recommendations in 2 months, what would your thoughts be on exchange rate being used as an instrument?
I think it's trade exchange rate as an instrument. Let me actually go back to something which is more fundamental. I'll come back to this. The fundamental current account balance, we've looked at it from the trade side, we've discussed very briefly. But the other side of the picture is what we call the investment saving balance. And I have said this for the last, it's actually in my last economic survey, which I did before I left, 2009-10, where I argued that, in the West, they focus only on the fiscal deficit. And I argued you really need to focus on the government saving investment balance. The government is a huge dissaver. It's the largest dissaver in the country. And therefore, we need to close this gap between government investment and savings, and that will translate exactly into the current account deficit. So it's the underlying macro balances which in the long term determine what happens in the current account. In the short term, it's capital flows. In the short term, it may be oil prices. Yes, certainly we have to look at them, but we cannot forget the fundamental macro balances, because in the long term, that's what will drive it. Okay. Now, coming back to the issue of exchange rate, yes, what we've had is we've considered this view from the 90s, and what we decided, again, I've been involved in tons of discussion of these things in the 90s, and what we decided was that you cannot fight exchange rate movements, long-term movements, but what you can do is when there is short-term imbalance or there's short-term misperceptions, according to you, the RBI should intervene, and presumably it still follows that policy. Now, what the problem has been is that last year there were there have been large capital inflows which resulted in a real appreciation. That is the second point connected with exchange rate. You have to look at the real exchange rate. You cannot keep looking at the nominal. And unless you bring the inflation differential down to zero, you have to look at that. It's not the same. If your inflation differential with the US becomes zero, then you can forget about the real exchange rate and focus on the nominal. Unfortunately, our so-called economic, there are too many amateurs in this game, the kind of people who recommended this black demonetization thing. They do not know the concept of real exchange rate, which is every theory which you learn from, from microeconomics up to your college, tells you that economics is all about real issues, real interest rates, real exchange rates.
Sure. Okay, Mr. Kher, let me ask you this. One, I would like to get your comments on this aspect of trying to use the exchange rate as an instrument in the medium to long term when it comes to trade. And B, we've seen what the government has announced by way of import curbs. We've seen the RBI stepping in to try and enhance liquidity in the system. What would you now expect in terms of next steps? Because as we've argued very clearly in the consensus is that by themselves, these measures are not going to have a significant impact either to rein in the current account deficit or perhaps even prop up the rupee beyond a point.
Yeah, I would tend to go along with this view that this limited 19 products related import curve is not in a very significant manner going to influence the current account deficit. Our total imports of these products is not large in proportion with what we import, and clearly that's not going to have a great impact. But I also want to say that this whole dimension of trade deficit, I think, does not have to be overblown. You know, trade deficit is essentially conveying the realities of the market. And I think what is more important is to address issues which make us competitive, in our exports. And that is where I think the greater efforts have to be directed. But this action by itself, I don't think has a great value, except that it is an action which supports a sentiment of having something done, and maybe that reflects in the markets.
Okay, well, what would your biggest concerns be? And I'll pose that question to you, Mr. Kher, in exactly 30 seconds to both of you. What would your big concern be? Dr. Virmani clearly is worried about moving back into an era of control and license raj, as he called it, with select imposition of curbs. What would your biggest concern be today? I'll come back to you, sir.
Yes, I don't think import restrictions are a good way of managing our export imports, and we should eschew as many opportunities as come our way of putting restrictions on imports, particularly when it comes to addressing issues of value chains and supply chains.
Okay, Dr. Virmani, the final word to you, sir.
Yeah. Right. So I think I think Mr. Kher is quite right when he picks on competitiveness. That is really the key. And if you look at the last ease of doing business, there was no change in the external side. They have a sub-index for external. There was no change in that ease of doing business external. If we want to get into the supply chain, we have to make sure that becomes easier. That would be my last comment.
And that perhaps is going to be something that the high-level advisory group that Mr. Kher is a part of will take forward when they have their first round of meetings, and they are expected to give their recommendations in 2 months. Mr. Kher and Dr. Virmani, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18 with your take on the implications of the import curbs announced and the next steps. When we return, the GST Council will meet tomorrow. On top of the agenda is the 10% cess proposed by the Kerala government, but could we see a national level cess being imposed?